Here we go. It looks like there's no one left in the waiting room. We have 19 people already online. Okay, it's promptly 5 p.m. Arizona time. We're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you all to Drone Safety Awareness Week. And I'm going to begin with a brief introduction. So as you are aware, this week is National Drone Safety Awareness Week. And we are going to present this UAS safety beyond the regs to you. And by we, I'm going to introduce now my two friends and I, drone pros. We'll start with Brian Baker.
Hello all, thank you for attending today's presentation. I hope you all find it informative and somewhat entertaining.
And Brian Stamper.
Hello, I'm looking forward to having this discussion with everyone and be anxious to hear anybody's questions and thoughts afterwards.
And I'm Sarah Nilsson. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started with this. If you look at your Zoom bottom of the screen, you will see that there's a chat box. Feel free to type in your questions along the way. One of the three of us, whoever isn't talking at the moment, will either address them then or we'll do it at the end. Also, we're going to we are making a recording of this, and it will be available tomorrow at my link on the screen there, sarahnilsson.org UAS law. Hold on, I got one more person to admit. Also, I'm going to be taking this recording and putting it on YouTube, so it's easily shareable. And then I will take all these slides for you and turn them into a big PDF and also put that on that same link. Now, if you participate in Wings and you'd like credit for today's Zoom webinar, just type your email that's associated with your Wings account into the chat box. And then at the end, I will screenshot everyone's emails and give you Wings credits accordingly. Perfect. Okay, so in case some of you are new to this Drone Safety Awareness Week stuff, this is the second annual National Safety Campaign hosted by the FAA. And it's a week of active virtual engagement where people from industry, people from academia, people from any drone organization, recreational, commercial, you name it, we all get engaged to learn more. This is the goal, to learn so that we can become safer in the airspace. Now, the job that we have as drone pros for the FAA safety team is to provide resources for you and help educate you on matters relating to drones. And the whole point of this week is a national conversation between everybody in the industry. Why do we do this? Primarily because UAS users are pilots, and pilots are part of the national airspace system. And as such, safety needs to be at the beginning of our minds, the forefront of everything that we do. We also were doing this because registered UAS are nearly 6 times that of crewed aircraft. So there are more UAS aircraft out there than there are manned aircraft. And also, we would like society to be more accepting of UAS. And if they know more about it, then they can accept it a little bit more. So this is why we have Drone Safety Awareness Week. Oops. Here's our agenda for today. I'm going to start us off with risk management and risk assessment. Then I'll hand the floor over to Brian Stamper for aeronautical decision making, crew resource management, and single pilot resource management. After that, I'll hand it over to Brian Baker, and he will talk to you about operator manuals, checklists, logbooks, pilot minimums, and some aircraft limitations. And it seems like people are still joining. We have 22 people now. This is excellent. Brian, I'd like to hand it over to you so that you can share your quote.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that. Yeah, this is something that I've observed as a professional practitioner of drone services in the National Airspace System and as a trainer on drone equipment. These are mainly the areas that I see as the most common areas for accidents and incidents to occur. And so, at the edge of visual line of sight, at low altitude in reverse orientation, winds aloft, exceeding aircraft capability, not reading documentation, flying production missions with new or unfamiliar firmware, and also people trying to fly outside of their experience level. Someone who's used to taking real estate photos gets a job as doing a survey job or some sort of inspection job, and they just haven't had the experience in that realm. So we'll touch on these in my section, so I'll turn it back to Sarah and we continue on with the additional part.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to share this document with you real quick. It is the Remote Pilot Small UAS Study Guide. For anyone who's on this Zoom webinar or listening to the recording, if you have received your 107 cert, this document should be familiar to you. If not, I'd advise you to take a look at it. And again, we'll be sharing this with you later, and you can check out the links. And this document is a wealth of information when it comes to risk management. First off, here's chapter 10. We're going to look at some of this. It's aeronautical decision-making and judgment, and it's going to talk about everything and then some of what we're going to be discussing tonight. So if you skim through this, and in the interest of time, I'm really going to skim, this is what you're going to see: the risk management process. You're going to see some human factors, some 5 hazardous attitudes, and how to combat them. You're going to see the PAVE checklist that the FAA uses for perceiving hazards. Then you're also going to see this aeronautical decision-making flowchart, which is extremely helpful, and Brian Stamper is going to delve into ADM a little bit later. You're going to see the DECIDE model, which is basically how to do your risk management. And then some operational pitfalls, which we sadly sometimes fall into. Lastly, we're going to talk about the stressors. And with these, we have environmental, physiological, and psychological. And I think Brian Baker has a couple of stories to emphasize this.
Sarah, yeah, I've had a couple of instances, one with one of my colleagues who unfortunately experienced a death in the family. And after my colleague's time off, they came back to work, and we had some training scheduled for a client, and he proceeded to begin to make preparations, and I told him that I didn't think it was advisable that he do any training for 30 days. And so I had him do other tasks while he was kind of grounded, because for that particular client, and well, all our clients, we need to be 100% head in the game. And so he understood, and he actually agreed. He said, "You're right, I'm probably not fit to fly emotionally." And then personally, I've had to ground myself. I was actually in the middle of a project in Florida in February when I got a call that my best friend had passed away suddenly. So I was devastated. I grounded myself and I put the project on hold. So these are things that people don't necessarily think of as being showstoppers, but they seriously impact your judgment and your situational awareness. So just wanted to share those. Thank you.
I appreciate that greatly, Brian. These are real situations that we're going to be discussing tonight. Continuing on the theme of risk management, and I just introduced PAVE to you, there's another risk management decision path that the FAA provides. And again, all these resources are FAA and they're free resources. You can download them. Here are the links for you. We also have to remind ourselves when we're flying UAS that risk is always going to be there. To stay safe, you need to know how to judge the level of risk. And in a little bit, I'll get into that with some diagrams, how to minimize it, and when to say, okay, we've got a bunch of risk, but we're going to accept it because in the name of the mission, we decide to take that risk into account and just go ahead anyway. And we'll talk about this go, no go decision again a little bit later on. Let's look at some language that is involved when we talk about risk management. We have to define the word hazard, a condition, event, object, or circumstance that could lead to an undesired event, like an accident or an incident. So for example, if the remote pilot is unfamiliar with the local area, with procedures or terrain features, when we encounter weather that wasn't in our forecast, it's actually worse. Or if the area has unusual features, let's say high terrain or some construction, this all factors into our hazard analysis. Risk is the potential impact of this hazard, which you do not control or you don't eliminate. The level of risk is measured by the number of people or resources affected, that's the exposure, the extent of possible loss, severity, now keep severity in mind, we're going to see that in the chart, and the likelihood of loss, and that's probability. And we're going to see that severity and probability come up again, so keep that in the forefront. Here is that risk management decision path that I shared with you in that document just now. And if you really want to delve into risk management in greater depth, I encourage you to download this risk management handbook. This is very, very, very detailed. So if you really want to delve into it, that would be where to go. Like I said, there's a matrix we use to determine risk. And if you look at this, like I said, severity and likelihood, and they go down both sides of the chart, you're going to see there's red, there's yellow, and there's green. And that's how we're going to gauge the risk when we do our risk assessment. We also have this. And then there's the PAVE explained a little bit more in depth. And this checklist, which we use to assess the risk on ourselves as humans. Safety risk management. Again, tons of resources on the FAA website. I've given you a screenshot here. Each one of these is downloadable PDFs if you want to dive very deep into safety risk management. And then advisory circulars, just to remind you, an advisory circular is the FAA's way of taking a CFR, a reg, and explaining how to interpret that reg. Advisory circulars are extremely important whenever you look at the regs, like this one has to do with Part 107. So when you look at 14 CFR Part 107, you should then go to the advisory circular for 107, which is this one, 107-2, and look for some more detail. You will see this hazard identification and risk assessment process chart. You will see, and this is all in the appendix at the back. You will see this, again, severity and likelihood. We're meeting those two words over and over again in our risk assessment. And again, some charts that show the unacceptable risk in red, acceptable if we mitigate it in yellow, and then green is completely good, we're good to go. Again, you can use numbers, letters, a combination of any of these charts, whichever works best for you. And before I hand it over to Brian Stamper, I'd like to talk a little bit about piloting command authority. It's worth mentioning that a UAS pilot is a pilot. In other words, you, the UAS pilot, just like every other pilot, you are responsible for the safety in the national airspace whenever you're flying. You are also the final authority as to the safety of the flight. This gives you a little bit of power. You can deny a flight if you think it's too risky. That is your authority. In other words, you oversee the go, no go decision that I spoke of earlier. And that is a decision you must make at every flight, and sometimes in the middle of a flight when you decide it's time to come home. Remember that your certificate, if you have a Part 107 certificate, is on the line. And if the FAA pursues enforcement action, you could lose that certificate. And if you don't have a certificate because you fly recreationally, you still may be fined. And if you lose your remote pilot certificates under 107, then if your job calls for that as a commercial pilot, you could lose your job. I'm going to let Brian Stamper take over from here and go into the aeronautical decision-making portion of tonight's program.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to kind of summarize the aeronautical decision-making process and why it's important. But the main reference we're going to be drawing from is Chapter 2 of the manual here. As we mentioned before, the FAA has some great manuals and they're all online. They're all free, so please take advantage of those. So what is the aeronautical decision-making process and why is it important? It's estimated that approximately 80% of all the aviation accidents are related to human factors. And aeronautical decision-making is a system that allows us to assess those risks, manage the stresses involved so that we can make safe flights and have successful missions when we're flying. Next slide. So it may not be obvious, but good judgment can be taught. And it's a very important skill to learn because proper aeronautical decision-making can enhance the process to decrease the probability of human error and increase the probability of a safe flight. And that's our entire goal, is to make sure everyone stays safe, make sure there's no damage to the aircraft, and that we don't damage any property or cause any increased risk. Next slide. So how do we go about it? Some of the steps for good decision-making are identifying personal attitudes hazardous to safe flight. We need to be willing and able to understand how our own approach to problems and how our own emotions can come into our ability to fly safely. We need to learn behavior modification techniques. What can we do to better develop ways of thinking and approaching our mission so that they stay safe? Learn how to recognize and cope with stress. These can be internal, behavioral, or they may be outside stresses that you have no control over. And we want to have ways of dealing with those. We also need to develop risk assessment skills. We need to be able to identify all the risk associated with the flight and how to assess how big those risks are and maybe how to mitigate them. We want to use all the resources at our disposal. That may be online, in person, written. There are constantly new things coming online every day. So we want to use all those resources available that may help us in our mission. And then we want to constantly evaluate the effectiveness of our own ability and our own skills during the aeronautical decision-making process. What worked well last time? What didn't work well? What can we do better next time? We want to constantly be evaluating and updating our method for providing safe and successful flights. Next slide. So there's 4 fundamental principles of risk management. The first is to accept no unnecessary risk. It's not possible to fly without risk at all, but we need to know what the risks are. And if any risks are too big, we want to make sure we deal with those. Risk decisions should be made by the person who can develop and implement risk controls. As Sarah mentioned, the buck stops with the certificate holder. You need to make sure that you're in a position to be able to make that call, because you might have a client or a boss who is pushing you to do something that may not be safe at that moment. And you need to be able to make the decisions not to do those things that would cause a problem. We want to be able to accept risks when that benefit outweighs the dangers. So we want to be able to assess when those risks are acceptable and when we have methods for mitigating them and dealing with them. Because risk is an unavoidable part of every flight, safety requires the use of appropriate and effective risk management, not just in the pre-flight planning stage, but in all stages of the flight. And it's important to remember that the entire mission starts at the planning stage and goes until it's completely finished. There's not just one piece that you need to be managing risk. You need to be constantly and continually reevaluating the risk through the entire mission. Next slide. As Sarah mentioned before, there are lots of advisory circulars. The one that is most closely related to the aeronautical decision-making is AC 60-22. It's a very good document. It's online, it's free. definitely a lot of good information and a very good resource. Next slide. So this is another way to mitigate risks. In the manned airplane world, cockpit resource management focuses on pilots operating in crew environments where you have multiple people working toward a common goal and how to manage communications and information. But many of these principles have been successfully applied and are very important to single pilot resource management. So these are skills that can help you stay ahead of the aircraft, help you plan ahead, help you make sure that you know what should happen and how to make that entire mission successful from the beginning to the very end. I just want to mention too that good communication is very important. If you have other crew members on the ground, you may have a visual observer, you may have clients standing by, you may have your boss watching. All those people need to know what their actions can be and what actions they shouldn't take. And communication between everyone involved in the mission is very important. And I think that brings me to a point where I'm ready to hand it over to the other Brian. So.
Thank you so much, Brian S. And handing it over to Brian Baker now. But before I do that, I just want to add one thing. Being a manned pilot first, or a crewed pilot, before the unmanned world came about, CRM is, like Brian Stamper said, about communicating with everybody who has the same goal to see the mission come to fruition. In other words, in the world of manned aviation, what that means is we're using all the resources at our disposal during flight. We're talking to air traffic control, we're talking to our co-pilots, our cabin crew, we're talking to everybody who has a stake in it, people giving us weather reports. And so in the unmanned world, we should take these ideas and concepts and see them through. So even when we're talking about flying by ourselves, we call that single pilot resource management. We're not talking to other people necessarily in the cabin or on the ground standing next to us, but we are still using our resources effectively, getting weather updates, maybe NOTAMs, maybe other things that are going on in the airspace. And so that is also part of the unmanned SRM. And so at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Brian Baker, who's going to continue from here.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you see my screen now? Okay, terrific. And thanks, Sarah and Brian, for that great recap of the regulatory side of the UAS regulations and safety risk management, crew resource management, and aeronautical decision making. For my part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the practical aspects of safety. And as a practitioner, professional practitioner of drone operations and a trainer, I see a lot of this put into practice firsthand. I also see a lot of mistakes that are made firsthand. And the first thing I want to talk about are operator manuals. They are highly neglected in the UAS environment, but unlike your DVR or your router or something like that, there's no time to call tech support while you're flying. You've got about anywhere between 10 and 20 seconds before a bad situation becomes unrecoverable and you're possibly dealing with an incident. So you need to understand how your aircraft operates, how all of its modes operate, what its emergency procedures are, and how the aircraft reacts to various inputs. So you need to read and understand the documentation thoroughly. And if there's something that you don't understand, reach out to the manufacturer. They'll be more than happy to help you understand that. Likewise, if you get any updates and release notes, whether it's just an update from the manufacturer saying something's a little different in the documentation or than the documentation stated, or if it's actually a firmware update. Firmware updates can have huge procedural differences. I had a case where I had a firmware update on an aircraft that actually changed the way the motors shut off after the flight. And had I not read that and gone through it after I would have landed, I wouldn't have been able to shut off the motors, creating an incredibly hazardous situation. So make sure you read the release notes. Understand emergency procedures. Those need to be committed to memory. We'll talk more about those a little bit later. And keep a copy of the documentation with the aircraft, whether it's on your phone in PDF form or whether it's hard copy, so that if you do have a question, you can refer back to it. Of course, not while you're flying, but after you got the aircraft back on the ground or before you get the aircraft up in the air, preferably. So the FAA talks a little bit about checklists when it comes to drones, but not a whole lot. And again, it's because the FAA really doesn't have any practical standards for drone operation. But they have this little checklist, drone safety tips, and all of these things should be incorporated in whatever checklist you use. And if you've got a checklist from a manufacturer, then those checklists are usually made for a worldwide audience. You need to incorporate US centric or Part 107 centric checklists into or items into that checklist. And this is the small checklist that the FAA provides. Depending on the drone that you operate, if it doesn't have a checklist, then make one for it using the previous example of checklist, along with some items that you may be specific to your little aircraft. Some aircraft are as simple as putting a battery in and hitting the power button, and then you're basically ready to go. But as you progress in the professional drone environment, you'll deal with aircraft that are more complex, more involved, and have longer checklists. This is an example of a checklist I made for my Mavic. It's in a little a sports armband thing that football players use. It's nice because I have different checklists for different aircraft, and I can just throw whichever one in there. So if you don't have one, make one, and more importantly, use it. And as your system changes or as you encounter different circumstances, then make sure you update your checklist. When you move into more professional environment, you're going to run into checklists that are like a pre-mission checklist, things that you need to do before you ever go to the field, checking weather, checking airspace, checking NOTAMs, making sure that you've got SD cards that are have sufficient capacity, making sure the batteries are charged, things of that nature. I can't tell you how many times I've heard of people spent hours driving to the field and they forgot the remote controller, or they didn't have an SD card because it got left in the laptop back in the office. So a pre-mission checklist ensures that you have everything you need when you get to the field. A pre-flight checklist ensures that the aircraft is fit to fly, that you've done everything necessary to get the aircraft ready to fly, unfolding the motor arms, unfolding the propellers, doing an aileron or control check, whatever, if it's a fixed wing aircraft, something along those lines, making sure that the aircraft settings are set correctly, the camera settings are set correctly, a lot of different things that you can do. And as the aircrafts again increase in complexity, these checklists can get fairly extensive. But the pitfall is that not using a checklist, you can completely waste a flight because you didn't have the camera on or it wasn't set properly. A flight checklist is usually pretty short because you don't want to go through a checklist while you're flying. It's usually going to be getting the aircraft in the air, making sure that all of the controls are working correctly, and then you're off on your mission. Emergency procedures that should be committed to memory include lost communications, lost visual line of sight, flyaway, a battery fire situation, and then other things that you should have handy, not necessarily committed to memory, are the nearest police, fire, hospital locations, so that if you do need emergency services, you can get those to respond as quickly as possible. And finally, a post-flight checklist. I like to see if there's any problems with the aircraft before I get back to the office, so I know that they need to be addressed before I want to go out and fly again, not be ready to go out and fly and discover that the aircraft has a problem. So checking the aircraft, making sure that you got the data that you want, that you have the video, the photos, the LiDAR data, whatever it happens to be that you're getting, that you have all of that, and you collect all your belongings that have been probably strewn about, cones and batteries and cases and all of that. So these are just some. This isn't an exhaustive list of checklists, but it is primarily the ones that I use. But I also use checklists in my day-to-day life for other things that are not aviation related. The FAA does have an advisory circular regarding standard operating procedures and that pertain to manned aviation operations, but could certainly apply to unmanned aircraft systems as well, regarding checklist and standard operating procedures. So that's AC 120-71B that you can take a look at. Another area I find pilots being fairly deficient in are logbooks. In the manned aviation world, we use logbooks for everything. And so much so that if it's not logged, it didn't happen. It's a way to basically demonstrate compliance, experience, maintenance, keeping records, things of that nature to any authority that requires us to do that. Now, I don't believe that the word logbook is even mentioned in Part 107. However, 107.7 states that the pilot do inspection, testing, and demonstration of compliance, and provide upon request, make available to the administrator any other document, record, or report required to be kept under the regulations of this chapter. This chapter meaning Chapter 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or the entire aviation regulation system. When you look at Regulation 61.51 that talks about pilot logbooks, it says that you need to keep logbooks specifically for the certificate that you have. And while there are no standards or requirements for UAS, it's still a really good idea to keep logbooks for your experience and your training, and then as well as the aircraft itself. You should keep a personal logbook, not just a logbook for your company. I had a student last week who had a couple of hundred hours of flight experience. I was training him on a new system. However, all of that experience had been logged as billable hours or flight hours with his previous employer, and he didn't have his own personal logbook and therefore could not demonstrate the fact that he did in fact have the experience he claimed to have, which is fine. I didn't, doesn't bother me in particular, but it's going to get more, be more of a requirement in the future for other things, possibly for other certifications related to UAS, large UAS, beyond visual line of sight, night flying, some other certifications that may arise in the future where we have to demonstrate that we have competency and experience with drones. As far as aircraft logbooks, you should keep a logbook for every aircraft, and it should detail anything that you've done to that aircraft. This particular example shows just basically firmware upgrades that are done on this aircraft. Haven't had any damage to the aircraft. That would be noted if there was damage and repairs, things like propeller replacements, battery replacements, any sort of damaged airframe parts that have been repaired. All of that gets done in the logbook, and that logbook stays with that aircraft throughout its life. And I log all of my drone flying, not just what I do commercially, but whether it's flying my large aircraft or flying something like this small little freestyle drone. I log it all. It all goes towards drone flying experience. So my particular logbook has probably a dozen different UAS in it that I've got time logged in. I can tell you how many hours I have on each of those aircraft, when the last time I flew each of them was, and then with the aircraft logbooks, I can tell you when the last firmware date or any maintenance that had been done to that aircraft. It can improve your insurability because insurance companies for drones are aviation insurance companies, and pilots are usually named pilots on the policies. aviation insurers want to have proof of experience in some cases. Every year I'm asked how many hours I have, if I've had any incidents, if I've received any additional ratings, and that all goes towards my insurability as not just a manned aircraft pilot, but a UAS pilot. And for those of us in the manned aviation community, we know that the FAA writes the regulations, but the insurance companies tell us what we need to do. So being a little sarcastic there, but in any event, it can be used as insurability demonstration.
If I may, Brian, if I may interrupt you for one brief second while we're talking of insurance.
Sure.
Speaking from a manned pilot insurance, because I get insurance on my aircraft, when you attend wings safety seminars such as this one, keep that also in your logbook somewhere, because speaking as a manned pilot, my insurance rates, my premiums go down each year if I show that I've attended these wings safety seminars. It makes me less of a risk to insure as a pilot. So always take these wings safety seminars, log them, keep them at the ready when you renew your insurance policy.
Yeah, that's great advice, Sarah. And like you, I keep all of my wing certificates in a folder, and every now and then I scan them in, and when I redo my aircraft insurance quote form, I send in that PDF with everything that I've done in the last year. Okay, so on to pilot minimums. Pilot minimums are a measure that we use in the manned aviation community to understand what our limits are as pilots, what our skill level limits are. And we can also apply those to unmanned aircraft systems. And the one thing that I see that most pilots can really benefit from is developing good stick and rudder skills. Stick and rudder is the term for flying a manned aircraft with a joystick and rudder pedals. But the term basically means to be a good manual aircraft pilot, whether you're flying a fixed wing drone or a multi-copter drone. Know how to fly it manually, know how to have your mind in the frame of the aircraft so that when the aircraft is not oriented correctly to the controls, that you still are providing the correct control inputs. So be able to fly the aircraft as well as you possibly can manually, because in the event that automation fails, you may be called upon to do that. Train for what you fly. This is really important. This kind of comes from scenario-based training, but if you're going to be doing a particular type of drone work, then you should train for that type of drone work. Have a place where you can safely practice the type of flying that you'll be doing, so that when you actually get on a real live billable project, you aren't experimenting for the first time. That's really not a good look at the very least, and it is a real dangerous situation at the very worst. So if you're going to fly cell towers, bridges, buildings, roofs, then train for what you fly. Again, don't rely solely on automation. Automation can fail, and when it does, you need good stick and rudder skills to be able to recover the aircraft, because you have a very, very limited window before that situation becomes unrecoverable. Don't try new things on projects. This happens a lot when you have spectators around or your clients around and says, hey, that's pretty cool. Now can you maybe do this? Maybe fly inside this building. You're like, I've never really done that before, but what the heck, let's try it. Not a good time, not a good thing to do. So this is where you have to say no as a pilot in command, and then go back and practice that particular skill before you attempt it on a project. Have a regular place to train and practice, and preferably not your neighborhood. If you fly in your neighborhood, all your neighbors will know you're a drone pilot, and if something happens with a drone in the neighborhood, something bad happens, they're going to come knocking on your door. as far as my neighbors are concerned, they don't even know that I fly drones, because I have a field that I go to train and practice that's safe, that there's no one around, no one can construe that I'm spying on their teenage daughter or whatever it could be construed as. So flying in your neighborhood is really not advisable, and have a safe place where you can go and practice. When you get a firmware update, that you can go and exercise the new features of that firmware update, or you can practice flying a light pole and to simulate flying some sort of cell tower or something along those lines. As a commercial pilot, we have to have medical certificates, which involves a vision check. So I get my vision checked and corrected if necessary every year. And I also require that all the pilots that I work with do the exact same thing, because one of the regulations is that you have to keep the aircraft within visual line of sight. And if your vision isn't so good, that's going to really limit your operations and impact possibly negatively your safety. I've seen a couple of instances where I've had students or customers that I really questioned their vision capability, and I actually in one case had to bring it to their supervisor's attention, and they were pulled off until it was corrected. So very, very important to have good vision. And then personal minimums, such as the distance of the aircraft from the operator. And this can be different for different aircraft. A small white aircraft is harder to see at distance than a large dark aircraft against a blue sky, that is. So those distances can be different depending on the aircraft. Wind limitations, what the aircraft's capable of and what you're comfortable flying in can be two completely different things. But as you gain more experience, slowly you can increase those minimums to the point that you can fly in stronger wind conditions. And remember that winds are almost always stronger aloft, even if you're only a few hundred feet above the ground, than they are on the ground. And if the wind is at the aircraft's limits on the ground, I guarantee it'll be above its limits aloft. Have a good launch and recover area. I call it a sterile area, someplace that's big enough that you can safely and successfully launch and recover the aircraft. And those areas can get smaller as you get more skilled. With my large aircraft, for example, I can use a space as small as a parking stall. With my very small aircraft, I can land it and take off from the back of my truck. I don't do that with the big aircraft. It's a different limitation. So just some examples of personal minimums that I have and that you should develop on your own. Aircraft limitations. Wind is the biggest of all of the limitations on the aircraft. And this accounts for so many aircraft incidents. It's probably beyond counting. A lot of times pilots will not take into account the direction and the speed of the wind, and while they use half their battery life to fly downwind, may not realize that they don't have sufficient battery life to make it back upwind, because it takes more energy for the aircraft to fly upwind than it does downwind. So a lot of aircraft succumb to battery exhaustion because of wind limitations. Don't add weight beyond the aircraft's limits. That can have adverse effects for the flight controller, because the aircraft flight controller onboard computer is designed to lift a certain amount of weight and hover at a certain level of power. And if you add weight to the aircraft, it can adversely affect that and cause the aircraft to perform erratically. Likewise, don't exceed the aircraft center of gravity. I've seen people put small weights like a GoPro camera on a 3-foot rod off the end of an aircraft. And that small GoPro weight adds a tremendous amount of moment outside the center of gravity of the aircraft, and can cause the flight controller to behave erratically, cause the aircraft to flip over when it seems like the aircraft should be able to perfectly handle that weight. Having it way out on an extended bar causes some real problems. Make sure that your return to home position is correct. If the aircraft has GPS positioning, give it time to get that position and make sure that the position indicator on your controller is telling you that it has a current home position. Don't just fire it up and take off. If something happens and the return to home position hasn't been reset, it may go back to the last place you flew, which who knows where that could be, or it may not have any latitude, longitude, so it'll try to fly to 0 latitude and 0 longitude. So you want to make sure that that home position is correct before you take off if your aircraft has positioning. And when in doubt, contact the manufacturer. I would much rather have the call from somebody saying, hey, I think about doing this. What do you think? And I say, well, yeah, maybe you could do that if you did it this way, but not if you do it this way. That's probably not safe, or no, just not a good idea. Don't do that at all. So don't be a test pilot. You don't have the training and the skill to be a test pilot. So contact the manufacturer if you're ever in doubt about aircraft limitations and any modifications you want to make to aircraft. Most UAS accidents happen because they're maneuvering the aircraft at low altitude or near obstacles with improper orientation, meaning the aircraft is facing them and the controls are backwards, or they're just at low altitude and trying to maneuver the aircraft in a tight space, which is taking off and landing in confined areas we talked about a little bit earlier. If you're in reverse orientation, you want the aircraft to go a little bit to the left, so you get a little bit of left input, but then it goes to the right, which is the way you didn't want it to go. Then you overcorrect and then you hit something and you break your aircraft and scratch someone's paint, and then people are upset. Flying beyond the wind limits, I think we kind of beat that one to death. Losing visual line of sight. And one thing that's important I want to circle back to, and that was what Sarah said with regarding to pilot and command. Regulation 91.3 that she referred to as being pilot and command and doing everything possible to ensure the safety of the flight. We have a regulatory limit of 400 feet. For flying drones in airspace without a waiver or some other authorization. And a lot of systems have the ability to put in a altitude limit. And so I see a lot of pilots that dutifully put in 400 feet as their limit. However, if you're flying at 400 feet and the aircraft either inadvertently or somehow goes behind some obstruction that obstructs your line of sight, the safest thing to do is to go up, not go side to side, because you can't see what is near the aircraft. If you have set your limit to 400 feet, the aircraft will not go up. So it's better to set your aircraft limit to something like 600 or 800 feet and use it in case of an emergency, not to regularly fly in, but you do have then some room to take emergency action if you need to. Again, the safest place to go when you've lost visual line of sight is up. Exceeding the range of the remote control in the aircraft. Typically when this happens, most systems now are smart enough that they just come home. And that gets back to making sure you have a good return home location and also that your return home altitude is sufficient to clear any obstacles that might be in that area. We also talked about battery exhaustion, flying until the batteries are completely exhausted. Not a good idea. The aircraft will just land where it is. And a PIC that didn't say no or had some hazardous attitude that was referred to earlier. Brian talked about 80% of aviation incidents are caused by human factors, or certainly contributed to by human factors. When it comes to drone accidents, that's probably closer to 95%. And it's because most drone pilots do not have the aviation safety training that we have in the manned aircraft community. But the good news is that most of these accidents can be prevented. Oh, of course, don't be stupid. Most of them can be prevented and avoided through what we've been discussing this evening, following the regulations. They're a good idea. Developing a a good safety risk management plan, using good aeronautical decision-making techniques and crew resource management that Brian talked about, using checklist, know your aircraft, know it really, really well, be the best possible pilot of that aircraft you can possibly be. Have pilot minimums, even if you're an expert expert pilot on a particular aircraft, you're still going to have your limitations. Know those limitations and adhere to them. Develop good stick and rudder skills, and know when to say no. So don't succumb to external pressures from a colleague, a client, a boss, whatever. I work for a large company, but nobody in the company has the authority to tell me to go if I say no go. And there's also no repercussions. So you need to make sure that in your organization, if you are a drone organization, that you have that corporate culture, that the pilot in command has the ultimate authority and that there's no repercussions for saying no. That's all that I have. And so with that, I am going to turn it back to Sarah.
Thank you, Brian. And I just wanted to share my screen one more time real quick and just fast forward here. I just wanted to remind people that joined late, if you could and you want Wings credit for this webinar, please type in your email address in the chat box. Sometime during Brian's presentation, I went ahead and lost connectivity briefly and the chat box erased itself. So at this point in time,
I've got copies of it, Sarah. So.
You do? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I was going to say I only saw one person in there, Michael Eakins. Everyone else just got erased real quick, but I'm glad Brian got that. But if you joined late and you want Wings credit, go ahead and throw in your email that's associated with your FAAsafety.gov account. And then I'm going to close with this, some more resources. Like I said, us Drone Pros and Brian Stamper is also a Wings Pro. These are what we're supposed to share with you so that in the name of safety, you all know where to go to get information. Like we said, all of these resources are free. The PDFs are beautiful in color. They're on the FAA's website. The latest regs should always be accessed from ecfr.gov right here, the second link. They're kept current as of a week ago. Every week they get updated. And then the Aeronautical Information Manual has way more stuff than you probably will ever use. And at this point, I'm going to open the floor up for questions and I'm going to monitor the chat box. And here are my two lovely puppers. And they are bidding you a that's all, folks. And open up the floor for questions.
I don't currently see any questions in the chat box. So if someone would like to ask live, just unmute yourself and feel free to ask away.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, to answer Anthony Andrioni, he said, is a copy of the presentation available? I came in late. Yes. So let me just refresh everyone's recollection here. This webinar will be turned into a YouTube video, which will be shared on my website, which I'm going to actually share with you right now. It has a UAS page that essentially, here we go. Essentially, my link is sarahnilsson.org. The page is UAS law up here on the top. And I've already put a placeholder right here for Drone Safety Awareness Week. We'll turn all the slides with all the links to all the free resources. We'll turn that into a PDF and upload it here tomorrow. And then we'll also take a YouTube recording of this webinar and throw it there as well. So hopefully that helps you.
So I have a quick comment.
Absolutely, Brian.
You mentioned earlier that, it's a good idea to keep a list of all the seminars and all the safety training you go to, any training at all related to it. You should keep a list of it for future reference because it's only going to get more important from insurance, and it's also good from a regulatory point of view if you have an incident. But this is where I'm going to give a shameless plug to FAAsafety.gov because like this presentation, Wings credit on FAAsafety.gov is available. And if you attend the ones that are sponsored by the Wings program, that system keeps a list of everything you've attended associated with that email. So you can always go back and print out a full log of all the seminars you attended if they're given credit for FAA FAST team. So
we've got a question, Brian. It says from Jim, do we have a preferred logbook? And I don't think that there's one that's particularly preferred. Some logbooks have irrelevant information in it. The logbook that I got, I acquired for UAS. I keep separate from my manned aviation logbook. And that logbook I acquired before UAS was even a thing. I got it out of Europe. And it's got a bunch of irrelevant information columns in it, things like that. Most drone logbooks, for example, will have like a from and to, just like a manned aircraft. We're not going really from anywhere to anywhere, but I use that to fill out the location. So there's a huge number of drone logbooks that are out there. Some of them are very extensive. Some of them are minimal. The example that I used was from ASA. They have a UAS logbook. It's small and like, I guess $13 or something like that is hardback. And it'll last you for several years. So that's, like I said, there's a plethora of logbooks out there. I don't know that one is really better than another. And I know that several people, you might have to get one or two and see which one feels right to you. But the things that you want to have are the date of your flight, the amount of time that you flew, the number of flights that you flew, the location that you flew, the aircraft and the aircraft registration that you flew, weather conditions and other notes like what was the flight for? Were you doing practicing? Was it a mission? Was it testing out new firmware? Things of that nature. So just make sure you've got enough room to write in the details about what it was you're doing, not just that you went out and flew for 30 minutes. Thanks for the question, Jim.
And Sarah?
Yes.
Craig and I would like to thank you and Brian for putting this together so quickly and doing such a great job. Just so much great information here. You guys do such good work and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, very informative.
Thanks, Ernie. Thank
you
you.
much, both of you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I'm looking at the chat box. We have 4 minutes remaining. If you have any more questions or if you'd like some other resources, you have 4 minutes. Oh yes, I have Drone Operators Logbook by Jonathan Ruprecht, Carolyn. I actually, he's a fellow attorney in Florida that I work with quite often in my law practice. And
he's got a great website, Rupert Law.
Yes,
some really great information on his website about UAS regulations.
if you guys remember that whole lawsuit against the FAA on the recreational pilots registration back in, oh gosh, was that 2016, something like that? Jonathan Ruprecht actually helped out Taylor. It was the Taylor case.
Jim asked if I have an example, or if we have an example of a bad example. So not personally. Fortunately, my clients and customers were dealing with very expensive equipment, so they take their stuff personally. If you want some bad examples, just go to YouTube and type in drone crashes. You will see all kinds of really, really bad examples. So, and I don't want to throw anyone under the bus specifically, but there's way more examples of way more bad examples on YouTube. And that's another thing. If you do something stupid, don't put it on the internet. Just it's not good advertising. And also the FAA will use that in the enforcement action against you. So they will find it, and you will be the victim of your own internet posting.
I should probably add that when it comes to FAA enforcement action, I have to say this as an aviation attorney, so pardon me. The FAA in 2015 implemented something called the compliance philosophy. So the FAA's goal, unlike in the not so distant past, is to educate before they punish. So compliance philosophy is a way of educating you and basically reaming you before they go ahead and take any further action. However, that being said, if you either are not compliant, meaning you adopt this attitude, or you just are blatantly, flagrantly just ignoring all the safety rules and regs, then unless that happens, the primary goal of the FAA is to educate. And of course, they'll put a note in your file. So if it happens again, and now it's a pattern of bad behavior, but that's a different story. Most people just learn with a little education, which is one of the reasons why, as an attorney, I'd rather be a drone pro or a FAA safety team rep, because I really want people to, learn so that they don't make silly mistakes.
Yeah, that's great information, Sarah. And I've actually had a customer, not one of my customers, but someone that I know experienced that firsthand. I was driving in Fort Collins a couple of years ago through a very, very busy intersection that was under construction, but it was still active, and hovering at about 150 feet right over the center of the intersection was a drone. And happening to know the surveyor for the city, I called him and I said, hey, oh, and I actually saw the operator in the company truck of who was operating it. So I called my friend at the city and I said, did you know such and such company was operating a drone over the Prospect intersection? He said, no, he didn't. I said, well, that's a regulatory violation, and because you've contracted them, you are possibly subject to liability as well. And he said, let me call you right back. So they contacted the construction company, asked them to cease drone operations, contacted the Denver Flight Standards District Office, the FSDO, and they were more than happy to educate them on the requirements and put them in touch with a drone pro that could help train them and get them certified and flying legally and understanding the regulations involved with doing what they were doing. So good example there.
Well, it looks like we are out of time. I want to thank Brian and Brian, the Brian Squared team, for helping me tonight with this presentation, and in such short notice too, like Ernie and Craig said. And I'd like to welcome everybody to stay in touch with us. We gave you our information, and we're also going to have all that available for the recordings for later, so that you can access everything you need from the links. So at this point, I'm going to end the recording. Bid you all a very good night.
Thanks everyone for attending.